Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. I'm Ben, and today we are going to take a deep dive into a motorcycle that I think we should all be excited about regardless of our feelings towards Chinese manufacturers. The IBEX 450 is a motorcycle that is going to change the future trajectory of medium and lightweight dual sport motorcycles, much like the Tenere 700 did back in its heyday. Some of it was features that it had, some of it was features that it lacked, and some of it was just the plain old specs and the awesome 270-degree parallel twin. And if you guys are unfamiliar, I was one of the first people in the US to own one of those bikes, and I still actually have it around, sort of. I guess I built it and sold it to my dad, who just took it out on a trip out west. There will be videos coming out on that this winter. And speaking of this winter, that is when the IBEX 450 is supposed to hit my dealers around here. And if you guys haven't checked, I was surprised to see that there were kind of a lot of CF Moto dealers around here. And if you guys are unfamiliar with CF Moto, you've never heard of them before, they've been making off-road vehicles for a long time, both ATVs and UTVs, and they seem to be climbing in quality. And now, well, according to the people that I watch and trust here on YouTube, like Chronicles of Solid, Jake the Garden Snake, Dork in the Road, and Spite, this motorcycle seems to really have followed suit and definitely seems like something that could be a good option in and of itself. But again, I think because of all the things that they have incorporated in this motorcycle, we're going to start to see a lot more of what we want, but also maybe start to see a little bit less of the things that we don't like. This bike does come with EFI. Of course, everything new is going to these days. We're not going to get a carburetor on a new machine anymore. The nice thing about this bike is that it does not have a ride-by-wire, which does mean cruise control is a little bit harder to sort of include from the factory. And that being said, this bike does not have cruise control. And I know a lot of people don't like ABS, but I think if you don't like ABS, it's because you've used it on a bike that doesn't have good ABS or is annoying to shut off. This is extremely easy to turn off. You can actually turn it off while you're moving, unlike the Tenere 700, where you have to come to a complete stop and hold a button for what feels like an eternity before you can get back on the throttle and go. There are also a few things that I've heard about this ABS system that I really like, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the off-road section. Unlike the revamped KLR 650 that I traded my DR 650 for earlier this season, the CF Moto IBEX 450 comes with an LED headlight, an LED taillight, and LED turn signals. Definitely some really nice things about having LEDs. Not only are they usually brighter and much more reliable than an old filament style bulb, but for things like a taillight and signal lights, that quick bright flash is just much better at grabbing attention than the rather slow ramp up and ramp down of an incandescent bulb. Honestly, I think every single motorcycle should have that just as a safety feature. Now, as far as the display goes, it looks like a pretty decently sized, nice looking color display that you can flip through ride modes on. You can check your engine temperature. It shows fuel level and also has a clock, which honestly I think is something, again, that every single motorcycle should have. I'm sure the last thing that you want to come along with a new bike is an app for your phone. I'm not sure if you have to have the app. It seems like for certain updates and stuff, you may have to download the app and connect it to the bike. There are also some nice features that go along with that. It seems like you can maybe control your phone with the control pad on the bike's handlebars, so you can answer calls and do maybe a few small things here and there. And while it's not available yet, it does appear that CF Moto is working towards being able to transfer navigation from your phone onto the bike's display screen, which is super nice. There are also some nice security features associated with having the app connected to your bike. Apparently you can track down the bike if it ever goes missing, which definitely could be a nice feature. Now, even if we look beyond the sort of mini T7 aesthetic that this bike has, it seems like the engine and transmission also are going to make this bike ride and feel and probably sound a lot like a Tenere 700, mostly because of the 270-degree cross-plane twin. Now, of course, we're looking at a much smaller displacement. The IBEX only has 449 cc's, where the Tenere 700 has 689. But this bike does come with a 6-speed transmission, which is something that I think a lot of KLR owners will definitely be happy to see. And much like the first T7s that came to the US, this is a new platform, but the engine inside of it is something that that has been tested in other CF Moto bikes. So that's definitely a good thing and something that really made me feel better back when I bought the T7. And with that engine retuned for adventure riding, it sounds like it puts out right around 44 horsepower at about 8,500 RPM. And while that is a little bit high on the rev counter, it sounds like this bike is going to put out its max torque just over 6,000 RPM, and that's going to be 32.5 foot-pounds. And if you guys have seen the comparison videos that I've done on the XR, the DR, and even the DRZ 400, those numbers really don't seem too far off. The horsepower is a little bit higher. It's also a bit higher on the RPM gauge. The red line of this bike seems to be somewhere from 8,500 to 10,500 RPM, which is certainly higher than a thumper. Of course, something that we should expect. But I was really kind of interested to see those numbers so close to the bikes that I'm building to be sort of lightweight adventure bikes. And again, I would definitely highly recommend you guys take a look at the videos that I watched that are linked down in the description. But it sounds like all of those guys felt like this bike was a fairly smooth bike, and that's definitely what I would anticipate. The engine, as brappy and deep-chested and cool as it sounds in the Tenere 700, definitely gives a nice smooth ADV type feel out on the road, and also has a sort of ADV type power delivery, and it really sounds like that's what this sort of mini version of it is going to deliver as well. And of course, that is just sort of what's going to happen when you have two cylinders. It's a lot easier to balance two pistons than one giant one in there like the bikes that I'm riding today have. As far as off-road abilities go, it sounds like this bike is going to be much better than any of the other sort of mini adventure bikes that are out there today. It seems like a lot of those are not really even adventure bikes. They're more a bike that you can sort of take on a light gravel adventure. Most of them seem to have cast wheels rather than spoked rims. I think they work, but they're not a bike that I think most people are going to buy and want to ride for a long time. Not to say that you can't, but I think this bike seems, again, like it's geared towards the people that want to buy a lighter adventure bike that can do great on the road and can really do great off-road as well. And is something that, while maybe would work great for somebody who's just getting into that type of riding, it also has enough ground clearance and suspension travel and the right type of suspension to be able to be a bike that you can grow into and may never want to grow out of. We've got a very beginner-friendly seat height of 32.3 inches, and there is a factory adjustment that you can actually drop it down to 31.5 inches, which is really, really, really nice when you're a beginner or somebody with a shorter stature. I'm 5'10", about 150 pounds, and I have a 31-inch inseam, and even with a low comfort seat on the Tenere 700, I definitely found myself in situations where that giant top-heavy feeling bike was just not something that was enjoyable to ride in tight single track or even really on any of the off-road trails that I would take it on. Yes, you can do it. Of course you can. But why risk dropping something like that on your leg and ending a season when you could ride something that's much easier to handle? And it sounds like it has a much lower center of gravity. Now, of course, when you have a low seat height, that often is accompanied by a low ground clearance, which certainly isn't good for off-road. On bikes like the KTM 390 Adventure, you really have enough to do a light gravel road, but you are probably going to be bouncing the bash plate off of some obstacles if you want to take it on anything hairier than that, where the 8.7 inches of ground clearance on the IBEX is basically, I think, what I had on the KLR 650. It is certainly a little bit closer to the ground than bikes like my DR 650, but honestly, this is an adventure bike. It's a bike that you sort of sit down inside of. It's made to be more comfortable on the road. It's made to be a little bit easier to ride, again, for a beginner. So 8.7 inches of ground clearance, I think, man, seems like more than enough to me. This bike is going to have just about 8 inches of suspension travel, which definitely is a pretty good number. Certainly not as much as the bikes that I'm on today, but a pretty respectable off-roading adventure bike type number. And beyond that, I think even more important than that number is the fact that not only is the suspension out of the box sounding like it's maybe even a little bit too hard for somewhat hard off-roading, even with a heavier rider, but it also has completely adjustable forks, meaning you can adjust the preload, compression, and rebound damping up front. The back sounds like it should have a preload adjustment as well as a rebound damping adjustment. So with all that in mind, I would think that 8 inches should be more than enough. Now, I call this bike a mini T7, but honestly, when you look at the wheelbase, it doesn't really seem like this is going to be all that small of a machine. At 59.3 inches, the wheelbase really isn't all that much different from the bikes, again, that I'm riding today. It is a couple inches shorter than the 62.8-inch wheelbase on the Tenere 700, but honestly, having it just a little bit smaller, I think really is probably a good thing. The Tenere 700 always did feel a little bit big off-road on the trails that I try to take it on. The rake on the 450 also seems pretty similar to that of the Tenere 700. The T7 has a 27-degree rake, where the IBEX has a 26-degree rake. And if you guys are unfamiliar, that's essentially the angle that the forks are stuck out at in comparison to a vertical line. And in general, a sport bike, something that's really meant to just be on the road, has a very sort of tucked in rake. Whereas on a dual sport or adventure bike, I tend to like to see that rake a little bit further out. It just sort of makes handling a little bit better off-road, especially in mud and sand and that sort of thing. So definitely a good number there. Next, however, we've got to talk about a number that, well, isn't so great, and that is the weight of this machine. It comes in at right around 430 pounds wet. Not the heaviest bike, about the same as a Gen 2 KLR 650. Certainly heavier than the bikes that I'm on today. 30 or 40 pounds lighter than a Tenere 700. And the bike's fuel capacity definitely plays into that. This bike can carry 4.6 gallons. That's almost 30 pounds in and of itself. So while 430 pounds sounds a lot heavier than the 369 pounds that my DR650 weighs, if you put the same 3 gallons in the 450 as you did in my 650, they would only be about 50-ish pounds apart, so maybe not the worst. But honestly, even with a full tank of fuel, if you compare the weight to the horsepower that the bike makes, that ratio is fairly similar to the DR and the XR, which are both, I think I would say, enough out on the road to have fun with, definitely enough to ride on the highway with. Maybe not anything beyond that, like say the 701 Enduro that I've got has. I mean, that has way more than enough power in any situation. So that's not going to be what you're looking at with this bike, but I think it does seem like it's a bike that, again, is going to have everything that most of us need. And with that 4.6 gallon tank, it sounds like at right around 55 miles to the gallon, this bike should get almost 250 miles to the tank, which is certainly better than the 74 miles to reserve that I get on my XR 650L. And where my DR650 has a 21-inch front and a 17-inch rear, the IBEX actually comes with a 21 front and an 18-inch rear, and not only are they spoked, but they are spoked and tubeless. And while as great as leaving the tubes behind sounds, it does sort of concern me that a lot of the dual sport tires that I'm used to using are a tubed tire, and I think some of them have a tubeless option, but not all of them. So I think we'll definitely have to look more at adventure type tires, which do tend to be a little bit more expensive rather than the sort of lighter weight tubed options that I'm used to. But if you're okay with the sort of less aggressive dry gravel-ish tire that it comes with, then maybe that would be a really nice thing on a long adventure. You can just plug a tire rather than having to actually swap a tube out. Now, it certainly would have been nice if they could have kept the wet weight of this bike under 400 pounds, but to be honest, with the seat height, the ground clearance, and everything that I'm hearing from the guys that have ridden this bike, it sounds like they kept the weight down low enough that, much like my DR650 in comparison to the Tenere 700 or even my XR650, it sounds like this should be a bike that feels fairly planted and easy to pick up because of the lower center of gravity. Definitely something that I look for in both an on and off-road bike. There's just not really anything good about having a bike that's top heavy. And again, if you're a newer rider or even just somebody that wants a bike that just feels good both on and off road, it sounds like this is going to be a great option. Now, this bike does come with a factory bash plate. However, it seems like one that would certainly need to be upgraded for the type of riding that I would want to do with this bike. That being said, they did keep the same replaceable frame rails that the Tenere 700 had. That is kind of a nice feature rather than bashing the bottom of the engine up with a big hit or bashing a frame up with a big hit. You're bashing a part up that is meant to be replaced. And again, much like the T7, the exhaust seems, well, a little bit lower than I would like it on this bike, but it sounds like it's tucked in enough that maybe it won't be as big of a deal. Again, though, the exhaust hanger is pretty long and something that I'm not really too fond of. I definitely like to have a pipe tucked up underneath the seat, or at least a little bit more out of the way of the ground, because of course we do have to anticipate that this bike is going to be on its side if you're going to take it off-road. Taking all of that into consideration, it does seem like this is a bike that is far more off-road oriented than really any of the other sort of mini adventure bikes that are out there. The CRF 300, I think, really leans more towards a dual sport adventure bike in my book, and maybe that one would be a little bit more off-road oriented. But honestly, if you're looking for a bike that you sort of sit down in and feels more like an adventure bike, but still want to be able to really tear into some nasty off-road trails, I think this is going to be probably the best option out there, at least right now. As I mentioned, this does have ABS, and it sounds like it is a perfect ABS system and setup. Not only is it extremely easy and fast to turn off, but you can turn the rear off, so you can still use the brake to sort of course correct, to slide around corners, but you also still have the safety net of the front ABS, and it sounds like it is a good enough ABS system on the front that it doesn't interfere with your riding, still allows you to stop, but would save you if you, say, grabbed a handful of front brake because another rider or deer, animal, something ends up right in front of you in the trail. You don't end up on your side. It's there to sort of help you come to a safe stop. The front is going to have a single 320 millimeter rotor with a single opposed 4-piston caliper. Rear brake is a single 250 millimeter rotor with a single piston caliper. The bike in general does seem pretty well thought out. It seems like the air filter is super easy to get at, just under the seat like most dirt bikes are. I haven't been able to confirm any of this information, but it sounds like the service intervals are pretty well spaced out, and I suppose we could probably reference the bikes that also use this engine, or that have been using this engine. So if any of you guys are out there and have experience with this engine, I'd love to know what the oil change intervals are, as well as the valve checks. It sounds like it's a little bit closer to the T7 than any of the other bikes that I'm riding today, which certainly would be nice. Of course, without seeing one in person, I have to lean on the other guys that I've heard from on this bike, but it sounds and looks, at least online, like this is a pretty high quality motorcycle, supposedly on par with the quality that the big Japanese manufacturers put out, which again is super nice to see and not something that I think a lot of us are used to or think of when we think of a Chinese manufacturer. There's also a lot of other features that I've noticed about this bike that I really like that would certainly be nice to see on other bikes going forward. Things like the nice wide foot pegs that do come with some little rubber dampers on the top of them that look to be easily removable, and then you've just got a nice big wide grippy foot peg. It does come with foldable mirrors, which certainly is a nice thing. They don't really look like the highest quality, but to be honest, as somebody that doesn't really feel the need or the urge to spend upwards of $100 on a set of double takes, it certainly is nice to see that coming on a bike from the factory. The windshield also looks like it is easily adjusted with just one hand, which is definitely a nice thing. Like I mentioned earlier, there is no cruise control. I think some people are going to be pretty disappointed in that. And much like a lot of the other adventure bikes like the T7, it doesn't come with any really good crash protection from the factory. They do, however, have some side crash protection available, and I'm sure the aftermarket will eventually come out with some front and rear crash protection. The handguards also appear to be just a light plastic wind block more than actual protection, so I would highly recommend and would personally stick on a full wraparound handguard for protection for your hands and for the levers. Looking at the factory add-ons beyond the crash bars, it looks like they've also got a higher rally seat. They've got some LED auxiliary lights, as well as a heavier duty bash plate. So looking through all that, watching the videos from the guys that have been able to take this bike out for a ride, to me, it seems like this is, I think, the unicorn bike that a lot of people probably wished the Tenere 700 was, and not to detract from the awesomeness of that machine, because it certainly is a great bike. But if you're somebody that is a little bit smaller or is just looking for a bike that's not quite as intimidating as the T7, I think this really is going to be a good option. it's certainly not going to have the same power and maybe isn't going to be enough on the road for a lot of riders. But honestly, I think as great of a entry-level ADV as this is, especially with the price, I honestly think this could be a much better option than a bike like the KLR. To me, this seems like an updated KLR, or what an updated KLR should be. And of course, I personally love my single-cylinder thumpers, but there are a lot of nice things about a parallel twin like this, and if you want to stick with a single cylinder thumper, there's plenty of bikes out there. I really like the Adventure Dual Sports that I'm building this season. I'd love to have you guys watching along if you want to hit that subscribe button and check out what I've been doing. But if you're somebody that wants something that feels and rides a little bit more like an adventure bike, again, something that you sort of sit down in, something that is going to be, well, a bit more comfortable out on the pavement for those long stretches, I think this is going to be a darn good option. Of course, you do have to look past the fact that it's not made in Japan. I know some people will just not be able to get past that. I don't know if I'm going to buy one of these, but boy, I sure would like to test ride one. So thanks for checking this bike out with me today, guys. If you want to see more videos like this or check out the other builds that I'm doing, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you guys watching along each week. Make sure you get out and explore this beautiful world God created for us any chance you get on any bike, no matter where it's made. But if you can't do that right now, here's more videos to check out in the meantime. And until next time, take care, stay safe, and stay swanky.